Right now, in the most connected era human beings have ever lived through, with more than 5 billion people carrying a device capable of reaching almost anyone on the planet in seconds, something strange and quietly devastating is happening inside the human mind. Roughly half of all adults in the United States report feeling lonely on a regular basis. Not occasionally, not in passing, chronically. And the most unsettling part of that statistic is this. It was true even before a global pandemic locked entire nations inside their homes. It was true while every person carried in their pocket an infinite stream of messages, photos, videos, and voices from people they knew and people they didn't. We are, by almost every measurable standard, the most digitally connected generation in the history of our species. And yet, a growing body of science suggests we may also be among the loneliest. This is the story of how that happened, what it's doing to the human brain and body, and why the two facts, unprecedented connection and unprecedented loneliness, are not the contradiction they appear to be, but two sides of exactly the same coin. To understand why this matters so profoundly, we have to start not with technology, but with biology, because loneliness is not simply an unpleasant mood. It is something far older and far more consequential than that. In 2023, the United States Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, did something almost unheard of in American public health. He issued a formal advisory, a category of warning historically reserved for the most serious threats to national well-being, and he devoted it entirely to loneliness. Murthy described what he called an epidemic of loneliness and isolation, an underappreciated public health crisis that has quietly harmed both individual and societal health for decades. The advisory's central claim was staggering, enough to make headlines around the world. Lacking social connection, the report found, can increase a person's risk of premature death to a degree comparable to smoking as many as 15 cigarettes every single day, a risk factor more severe than obesity, more severe than physical inactivity. This was not metaphor. This was not exaggeration for dramatic effect. This was a formal conclusion drawn from decades of epidemiological research, delivered by the nation's top physician, warning that disconnection itself, the simple absence of meaningful relationship, functions as a measurable, quantifiable threat to the human body. That claim traces back to a psychologist who spent much of her career forcing the scientific establishment to take loneliness seriously as a matter of life and death, rather than dismissing it as a soft, sentimental concern. In 2010, Julianne Holt-Lundstad, working at Brigham Young University, pooled together data from nearly 150 separate studies, encompassing more than 300,000 people, to compare the mortality risks associated with different lifestyle factors. What she and her colleagues found was that the strength and quality of a person's social relationships carried as much influence over their risk of death as other firmly established risk factors, including smoking itself. 5 years later, she went further, isolating loneliness as a distinct, measurable variable rather than folding it into the broader category of social connection. Index 54.1. Analyzing data spanning more than 3 decades and drawing on medical, psychological, and social work research databases, she and her team found that loneliness alone was associated with a 26% increased likelihood of early death, social isolation with a 29% increase, and living alone with a 32% increase. These were not soft correlations buried in the margins of academic journals. These were signals loud enough and consistent enough to eventually reach the desk of the Surgeon General of the United States. Loneliness, it turns out, does not simply make us sad. It appears to shorten our lives. But why would a subjective feeling, something entirely internal, something no doctor can see on an X-ray or measure in a blood test, carry the same weight as a pack of cigarettes? The answer takes us deep into evolutionary history, to a psychologist named John Cacioppo, who spent more than 2 decades of his career trying to understand exactly that question. Cacioppo proposed something radical for its time. Loneliness, he argued, is not a character flaw, not a sign of social failure, not evidence that something is broken in a person. It is a biological alarm system functioning in precisely the same way that hunger and thirst function. Just as hunger motivates an organism to seek food and thirst motivates it to seek water, loneliness evolved as a signal that motivates an organism to seek social connection. Because for nearly the entirety of human history, social isolation was genuinely, literally life-threatening. Our ancestors survived in small, cooperative bands. They hunted together. They shared food. They defended their children and their elderly and their sick collectively. And any individual cast out from that group, left to fend for themselves against predators and starvation and rival tribes alone, faced odds of survival that dropped catastrophically. The brain that survived, the brain that got passed down to every single person watching this right now, is a brain hardwired to treat isolation not as an inconvenience, but as a 5-alarm biological emergency. And that alarm system does something more than simply make us feel bad. Working alongside his wife, the neuroscientist Stephanie Cacioppo, John Cacioppo helped uncover something almost paradoxical about what loneliness does to the mind. Their research suggested that loneliness produces an implicit hypervigilance toward negative social stimuli, an unconscious automatic tendency to scan the social world for threats, rejection, and danger, even while the lonely person consciously, desperately wants nothing more than connection. In one striking experiment using high-density brain imaging, the Cacioppos found something remarkable about timing itself. Lonely participants distinguished threatening social images from neutral ones in roughly 116 milliseconds, more than twice as fast as none. Lonely participants, whose brains took closer to 252 milliseconds to register the same threat. In other words, the lonely brain isn't simply sadder. It is faster, more alert, more defensive, scanning every interaction for the possibility of rejection before conscious thought even has time to catch up. This produces a devastating irony that researchers now consider central to understanding chronic loneliness. The very state that makes a person crave connection most urgently is the same state that makes them least able to receive it warmly, because their nervous system has quietly rewired itself to expect danger from the very thing it's desperately seeking. This is where the story of loneliness collides directly with the story of the smartphone, because the digital age did not invent human isolation. What it did was something more subtle, and in some ways more dangerous. It offered something that looks remarkably like connection, feels momentarily like connection, and yet, according to a growing body of research, frequently fails to deliver the actual biological and psychological nourishment that real connection provides. Few people have studied this gap more closely than Sherry Turkle, a professor at MIT who spent 15 years and hundreds of interviews investigating what happens to relationships once they migrate onto screens. Her central finding, distilled into the title of her landmark book, describes a generation that has learned to expect more from its devices and less from each other. Turkle observes something that should sound uncomfortably familiar to nearly anyone watching this. People surrounded by hundreds or thousands of digital connections, seemingly never alone, checking in constantly, posting constantly, messaging constantly, and yet describing themselves as profoundly, achingly alone. Turkle argued that developing technology promises closeness, and sometimes it delivers, but that much of modern life leaves people less connected to actual people and more connected to simulations of them. Digital communication, she found, offers something Facebook itself embodies, almost perfectly. Human contact, only easier to engage with, and just as easily avoided the moment it becomes demanding or uncomfortable. To understand why a text message cannot fully substitute for a face-to-face conversation, we need to look at what actually happens inside the human nervous system during real, embodied social contact, something that has almost nothing to do with the content of the words exchanged. When two people speak face-to-face, an extraordinarily complex, largely unconscious exchange takes place. Eye contact regulates arousal in the nervous system. Vocal tone, pitch, and pacing convey emotional nuance that text simply cannot carry. Subtle facial microexpressions, lasting fractions of a second, communicate warmth, hesitation, empathy, and sincerity in ways that emojis were only ever a crude, symbolic attempt to approximate. Physical presence itself triggers face-to-face conversation, even a short one, produces measurably greater increases in feelings of connection and well-being than an equivalent amount of time spent texting or scrolling through a feed. The nervous system, it seems, knows the difference between real presence and its digital echo, even when the conscious mind convinces itself otherwise. The 2023 Surgeon General's advisory captured something particularly troubling about how this plays out generationally. Index 44A1. Across every age group studied, people were found to be spending measurably less time with each other in person than they had 2 decades earlier, and this decline was most severe among young people between the ages of 15 and 24, who reported roughly 70% less in-person social interaction with friends compared to previous generations at the same age. Murthy offered a nuanced observation about why this happens, one that resists the easy, simplistic narrative of technology as a purely malevolent force. He noted that for many young people, being online has become a genuine way to find community during a period of life when in-person options may feel limited or unavailable, even as the same technology often maximizes the amount of time young people spend online at the direct expense of the in-person interaction that their developing minds and bodies still fundamentally need. This is the trap at the center of the entire story. Digital. Connection is not simply fake or worthless. For isolated, marginalized, or geographically distant individuals, it can be a genuine lifeline, but it was never designed and was never capable of fully substituting for the deeper biological and psychological nourishment that embodied human presence provides, and an entire generation has now grown up mistaking the substitute for the substance. There is a particularly haunting concept buried inside modern loneliness research, one that goes some distance toward explaining why simply being surrounded by people, even people we love, doesn't always solve the problem. Researchers distinguish between social isolation, the objective, countable absence of relationships, and loneliness itself, the subjective, painful gap between the connection a person has and the connection they actually need. It is entirely possible to be surrounded by family, coworkers, and hundreds of online followers while feeling profoundly, existentially alone, because the ache of loneliness is not a headcount problem. It is a depth problem. Harvard researchers studying this distinction have described something they call existential loneliness, a fundamental sense of disconnection from other people or from the world itself, and found that a majority of people identified as lonely reported feeling, in some essential way, separate from everyone. There's also a curious, increasingly common variant of this substitution effect that researchers have begun studying with real seriousness, one that would have sounded like science fiction just a generation ago. Psychologists have long used the term parasocial relationship to describe the one-sided emotional bond a person can form with a media figure, a talk show host, a novelist, a musician, someone who has no idea the other person exists, and yet whose presence, delivered consistently through a screen or speaker, can feel genuinely intimate and comforting. For most of the 20th century, this was a relatively minor psychological footnote, confined to a handful of television personalities and radio hosts. In the digital age, it has exploded into something far larger and far more central to daily emotional life. Millions of people now spend hours each week watching the same online personalities, listening to the same podcast hosts, following the same influencers, absorbing what feels, moment to moment, like genuine companionship, a familiar voice, a familiar face checking in on their day. And for isolated or lonely individuals in particular, these one-sided bonds can provide real, measurable comfort, a sense of company during otherwise empty hours. But researchers studying parasocial attachment have raised a consistent concern. Because the relationship flows in only one direction, because the influencer or host never actually knows the viewer exists, it cannot provide the mutual recognition, the reciprocal vulnerability, the sense of truly being seen by another person that appears to be the actual active ingredient in what makes real relationships protective for mental and physical health. It offers the emotional texture of closeness without its substance, which may explain why heavy reliance on parasocial bonds so often coexists with, rather than resolves, the deeper ache of loneliness underneath it. Dating applications present a related and equally revealing case study because they were explicitly designed to solve exactly the problem this documentary has been describing: human beings struggling to find romantic connection in an increasingly atomized, digitally mediated world. And yet researchers studying their psychological effects have documented something unexpected. The sheer abundance of potential partners presented by a swiping interface appears to trigger what psychologists call the paradox of choice, a phenomenon in which having too many options paradoxically makes people less satisfied with whichever option they eventually choose and less willing to invest. The sustained effort that deep connection actually requires, because another profile, another possibility, is always just one swipe away. Some researchers have found that this abundance can subtly recondition how people evaluate potential partners altogether, encouraging rapid surface-level judgment based on a handful of photographs rather than the slower, more forgiving process of getting to know someone gradually in person, the very process through which most lasting human bonds have always been built. The tool designed to cure loneliness can, under certain conditions, end up training the mind to treat other human beings as an endless, disposable catalog, which is very nearly the opposite of the deep, particular, hard-won recognition that actually seems to protect people from the ache Cacioppo spent his career studying. This raises a difficult question that researchers have circled for years now, one without a fully settled answer. Is technology itself the cause of rising loneliness, or is it simply the most visible symptom of much deeper, slower changes already reshaping how human beings live? The evidence suggests something more layered than a simple villain narrative. Long before smartphones existed, sociologists were already documenting a quiet erosion of the institutions that once reliably brought people together: community organizations, religious congregations, neighborhood gatherings, recreational clubs, the everyday, unglamorous social infrastructure that for centuries gave ordinary people regular, low-stakes contact with one another. That decline was already underway by the final decades of the 20th century, well before the first smartphone was ever sold. What digital technology appears to have done is arrive at precisely the moment those older structures of connection were weakening and offer something that felt, at least initially, like an adequate replacement. It wasn't a replacement. It was, at best, a pale echo, optimized not for human well-being, but for something else entirely. Attention, engagement, and the amount of time a person could be persuaded to keep scrolling. And this is where loneliness research and the psychology of technology design intersect in a way that should trouble anyone paying close attention. The platforms built to keep. People scrolling were never optimized to deliver the specific, embodied, oxytocin-triggering nourishment that genuine human connection provides. They were optimized for something measurable in a boardroom, minutes of daily active use, and it turns out those two goals are not the same thing at all and are sometimes in direct opposition. A feed engineered to maximize engagement will always favor content that produces a quick emotional spike, outrage, comparison, validation, novelty, over the slower, quieter, less immediately stimulating experience of a real conversation with a real person sitting across from you. Over years and years of this substitution, an entire population can find itself technically more connected than any generation in human history by every available metric, message volume, friend counts, daily active minutes, while growing hungrier and hungrier for something those metrics were never designed to capture at all. So, what does the research suggest we actually do about this now that the alarm has been sounded at the highest levels of American public health? The Surgeon General's advisory did not simply diagnose the crisis. It proposed a national strategy built around 6 foundational pillars, ranging from strengthening the social infrastructure of everyday life, parks, libraries, and public gathering spaces, to what the advisory specifically called reforming digital environments, urging a critical, honest reevaluation of society's relationship with the very technologies implicated in the problem. On an individual level, the psychological research points toward something almost defiantly old-fashioned. Deliberate, scheduled, in-person contact, even brief contact, appears to matter more for genuine well-being than almost any quantity of digital interaction. Turkle herself, after 15 years spent documenting the erosion of face-to-face connection, arrived at a conclusion that sounds almost radical in its simplicity. That solitude, real, unmediated solitude, and genuine conversation are skills, not defaults, and that a generation raised on constant digital contact may need to consciously relearn both. It would be a mistake, though, to imagine this crisis belongs only to the young, to teenagers hunched over glowing screens late at night. The research reveals something far more universal, touching nearly every stage of the human lifespan in its own distinct way. Among older adults, social isolation carries its own particular set of dangers, ones that compound as the years pass. Retirement removes the daily, built-in social contact of a workplace. The deaths of spouses, siblings, and lifelong friends steadily shrink a person's circle of close relationships, often faster than new ones can be formed to replace them. Mobility limitations can make even simple, once effortless social outings, a visit to a neighbor, a trip to a place of worship, physically difficult to sustain. Researchers studying isolated older adults have found associations between chronic loneliness in later life and a measurably higher risk of developing dementia, alongside elevated rates of cardiovascular disease and depression, a pattern serious enough that some economists have even attempted to calculate its financial toll on national healthcare systems, estimating billions of dollars in excess medical spending tied to isolation among the elderly alone. For this population in particular, technology's promise and its limitations both come into sharp focus. A video call with a distant grandchild can provide real, meaningful comfort that simply wasn't available to earlier generations of aging adults. But it cannot fully replace the friend who used to stop by unannounced, the neighbor who used to check in, the community that used to simply exist around a person without requiring any deliberate, effortful maintenance at all. At the opposite end of adulthood, inside offices and workplaces that would seem, on the surface, to be saturated with social contact, researchers have documented a similarly persistent, if quieter, form of loneliness. Studies on workplace connection have found that a substantial share of employees, roughly 2 out of every 5 surveyed in some research, report feeling isolated even while surrounded by colleagues for 8 or more hours a day. The explanation researchers offer echoes almost exactly what Turkle observed in personal relationships. Modern work for many people is now conducted increasingly through screens, messaging platforms, video calls, shared documents rather than the informal. Hallway conversations, shared lunches, and unstructured downtime that once wove coworkers into something resembling an actual community. The consequences extend well beyond individual well-being into measurable business outcomes. Researchers have found that employees who report a strong sense of belonging at work take dramatically fewer sick days than those who feel excluded and are promoted and given raises at substantially higher rates, suggesting that the ancient biological machinery Cacioppo spent his career mapping doesn't switch off simply because a person is clocked in for the day. It follows us everywhere, into every room we occupy, quietly keeping score of whether we are, in the deepest and oldest sense of the word, safe among our own kind. There is one further discovery in this field that reframes the entire crisis in a way few people expect, because loneliness, it turns out, does not simply live inside a single isolated mind. It spreads. Researchers analyzing decades of health data gathered from a long-running study of thousands of residents in a single American town uncovered something that initially seemed almost impossible to believe. Loneliness appeared to move through social networks the way a contagious illness might, radiating outward from person to person along the actual lines of friendship and family connection. When one person in the study became lonelier over time, the people directly connected to them, their friends, their neighbors, their family members, showed a measurably increased likelihood of becoming lonelier themselves in the years that followed. And that effect didn't simply stop there. It rippled outward to a second and even a third degree of separation, touching the friends of friends of friends, people who had never even met the original lonely individual. The mechanism researchers proposed for this pattern connects directly back to everything already established about the hypervigilant, threat-scanning nervous system Cacioppo spent his career studying. A person experiencing chronic loneliness, primed by an unconscious expectation of rejection, often begins, without ever intending to, withdrawing slightly from the people around them, offering less warmth, less initiation, less of the small everyday gestures that sustain a relationship. Those around them, sensing the withdrawal but rarely understanding its true cause, tend to respond in kind, pulling back themselves, and the isolation spreads outward like ripples across still water. One relationship quietly cooling into the next. This finding carries a genuinely sobering implication for the digital age specifically, because if loneliness can spread across a network of a few hundred in-person relationships in a single town, the sheer scale of a hyper-connected networked society, where a single person's mood, behavior, and withdrawal can ripple across thousands of digital connections simultaneously, raises a genuinely unsettling possibility that the loneliness epidemic identified by the Surgeon General may not simply be an accumulation of millions of separate private struggles occurring in parallel, but something closer to a single vast interconnected social phenomenon, spreading quietly through the very networks that were supposed to prevent it in the first place. Investment appeared to ripple through social networks with comparable force, meaning that a single person's decision to reach out, to check in on a withdrawn friend, to initiate rather than wait to be invited, carries an influence that extends well beyond the individual relationship in question. This reframes something that can otherwise feel like an impossibly large, faceless societal crisis into something closer to an intimate, achievable act. There is, buried inside all of this difficult, sobering research, something genuinely hopeful, and it has to do with the very nature of the alarm system Cacioppo spent his career studying. An alarm that evolved to motivate reconnection is not a life sentence. It is, by its very biological design, a call to action, one that can still be answered. Just as hunger resolves the moment a person eats, and thirst resolves the moment they drink, loneliness researchers have found that the acute pain of isolation can begin to soften remarkably quickly once genuine embodied connection is restored. A phone call instead of a text, a shared meal instead of a shared post, an actual conversation instead of a scroll through someone else's. The nervous system that hypervigilantly scans for social threat can, with consistent, safe, repeated contact, gradually recalibrate itself back toward trust. The circuitry is ancient, but it is not fixed. It responds, the way it always has, to the real thing. Perhaps the deepest, strangest truth uncovered by this entire body of research is this. The human brain walking around today, scrolling through a feed at 2 in the morning, checking a phone for the 11th time in an hour, hoping for some small sign of being seen, is functionally the same brain that once huddled around a fire with a few dozen other people, utterly dependent on their presence for survival. We built machines capable of simulating the surface texture of connection with breathtaking precision, the notification, the like, the message preview, and without ever managing to replicate its substance. And in doing so, without quite meaning to, we conducted the largest uncontrolled experiment in the history of human social life, testing whether an ancient, embodied, deeply biological need for closeness could be satisfied by something flat, silent, and mediated by glass. The early results of that experiment are now in, delivered not by science fiction writers or cultural pessimists, but by the United States Surgeon General, by neuroscientists studying reaction times in milliseconds, by epidemiologists comparing mortality curves to those of lifelong smokers. The verdict, so far, is sobering, but it is not hopeless, because the same research that revealed the depth of the problem also revealed something quietly reassuring about human beings themselves. We are, at our core, still exactly what we always were. A species built for real presence, for real voices, for real faces across a real table, and no matter how sophisticated the Simulation becomes some fundamental part of us continues, patiently, insistently, to recognize the difference and to ache for what only the real thing can give.